We have more data, processing power, and predictive modeling than at any point in human history. Yet major corporations, governments, and complex infrastructure networks still routinely make catastrophic decisions despite having all the information they could possibly need. When a massive system fails, the default assumption is that it lacked sufficient information or that it simply ran out of viable options to survive. But a theoretical option doesn't actually matter. A future might exist in principle, but if an organization or an individual cannot perceive it from their current position, they cannot execute it. This distinction is the foundation of a framework known as accessibility geometry. It separates the vast, unrestricted space of everything that could happen, possibility, from the specific set of futures a system can realistically reach, accessibility. Systems don't navigate possibility, they navigate accessibility. They can only move toward futures that remain visible, reachable, and structurally admissible from their exact current coordinates. Whatever falls outside those boundaries, no matter how optimal, is effectively invisible. To understand why a complex organization thrives or fractures, we have to stop analyzing what it could theoretically do. We need to map the invisible boundary conditions that dictate what it is actually capable of seeing. This technical diagram illustrates the process of reconstructability. Observers do not interact directly with reality. Instead, as shown by the projection operator mapping a boundary substrate down into an observer space, systems continuously construct and update internal representations of their environments. This generated spatial model is strictly constrained. The rendering of the horizon and the available vectors depend entirely on the observer's specific position and scale within the larger system. Because of this positional dependence, two observers can inhabit the exact same physical environment while possessing radically different navigational landscapes. A trajectory that is painfully obvious to one might be entirely blocked from the other's internal model. A system cannot reliably navigate a reality it cannot reconstruct. If the internal model fails to generate a specific pathway, the system will never take it. When major organizations collapse, it is rarely because the physical environment suddenly became impossible to traverse. The failure happens internally. The mechanism driving this is ideological narrowing. Over time, an observer's internal model can harden, becoming fiercely resistant to modification, even as outside conditions drastically change. This rigidity begins restricting the boundaries of what the system can process. Trajectories that were previously highly accessible are actively walled off. Prosically viable alternative futures are reclassified by the system's own logic as inadmissible, irrelevant, or entirely unthinkable. The outside environment is fine, but the system's internal map has boxed it into a corner. This end state is accessibility collapse. The actual geometry of the world remains the same, but the observer experiences a catastrophic contraction of visibility. Institutions fracture and companies go bankrupt, not because their options vanished into thin air. They fail because their rigid internal models rendered the surviving trajectories literally invisible to them. There is a structural antidote to this kind of collapse, and it emerges through the generation of shared geometry. Through repeated interaction, shared constraints, and established trust, isolated observers can overlap their internal maps. They snap their separate models together to form a much larger, cohesive navigational lattice. This overlap drastically reduces the computational burden on every individual node. Instead of forcing a single observer to reconstruct the entirety of a changing reality from scratch, the network shares the cognitive load, allowing for frictionless coordination. Shared geometry functions as an invisible physical navigational infrastructure. It allows federated systems to see, verify, and access survival paths that a single, isolated observer would never be able to reach on its own. Surviving long-term is not a puzzle you solve once. It is a continuous process of recomputation. Recomputation is the ability of a system to dynamically tear down and rebuild its internal geometry in real time, matching inevitable shifts in the outside environment. To maintain this capacity, a system requires a specific defense mechanism, structural humility. Structural humility does not imply uncertainty, weakness, or a lack of conviction. It simply means preserving the structural legitimacy to revise your internal models the moment sufficient corrective evidence appears. When a network balances deep shared integration with the absolute flexibility to rewrite its own boundaries, it avoids the trap of ideological narrowing entirely. It remains capable of finding viable trajectories even under extreme stress. True resilience, whether you are looking at a human mind, a corporate network, or an entire society, is never about attempting to dominate every possible outcome. It is the active, continuous protection of your capacity to perceive new pathways when the world inevitably changes.